All right, so we've had some questions about how species form, and you guys have learned a little bit about natural selection and evolution. Um, and just to remind you about that, with evolution, you have variations in a population, and some of those variations are going to be just favorable for the survival of the individual, and um, the the different environmental conditions will determine what variations are favorable. And if you have that favorable trait, you survive, you get to reproduce more often, and the next generation looks more like you. Um, the variations that you have will lead to long-term accumulation of changes, and so over time, a family line doesn't look like it started out as. But as far as the question of how does a species actually form, we're going to actually take a look here real quick. So the first question is, what is a species? When you look at these four different spiders, um, just kind of how would you describe them? They all have different looks. You can't really get a size kind of scale on here, but they're all pretty similar size. Are these different species or not? Um, in answer to that question, they're actually all the same species. They just have different variability. So, it's tough to determine sometimes what a species is and what's not a species, just because we have so much variability within a trait. This is why for a long, time period, people thought that different dog breeds were actually different species, but they're actually not. So, kind of getting down into what a species is, the best functional definition we have is it's a population of interbreeding organisms that produce, fertile offspring. So with dogs, they can all interbreed with one another, sometimes with help, but they create viable offspring. All these spiders, they create viable offspring. Um, a species is really a man-made idea. It's not something that really exists in nature. Okay, so here's another example. When you look at these two different sparrow species, they look the same, and so you would think they are the same species, but in actuality, they aren't going to be the same species at all. They don't interbreed. So species has more to do with, do you interbreed with one another and make viable offspring than do you look the same. Looks don't matter really. Um, so we already talked about dog breeds, but are dogs separate from wolves? Most people say yes, but if you take a look at them, dogs and wolves can breed with one another and make viable offspring. Some people do that from time to time, and that you know that begs the question: is this a good definition for species or not? So. Studies show that they are not the same species again because they don't interbreed in nature. There are some major behavioral differences in dogs and wolves as well, though. So, this definition of can they interbreed is not even, a perfect definition. Just keep that in mind as we keep going through here. Wolves, if you take them and you raise them by, hand from the time they're born, they don't end up being like dogs. They have some kind of genetic difference, even though they can interbreed with dogs, that makes them, behave differently from dogs. So you can't go by looks. Um, you know, interbreeding isn't necessarily the key either, but it's the best thing we got to go on. So a lot of people kind of think, do we make new species based on like hybrids? Hybrids is where you take two species, breed them together, and get something new. So you take a look at this thing right here. This is a mule. It's the offspring of a donkey and a horse. Um, this is a offspring of a porpoise and a dolphin, a horse and a zebra up here. This is, I believe, a leopon, which is a lion and a leopard or something like that. And then this is a type of a liger, I think. It has lion and tiger DNA. Are these a new species? I mean, they look totally different from their originals, but are they a new species? This is another one. This is a cross between a grizzly bear and I believe a Kodiak bear, some kind of brown bear. So, oh, sorry. Going back here, hybrids are usually considered a new species because they oftentimes don't create offspring that can breed at all. So looking back at all these different things, all of these organisms are just sterile. They can't make any offspring. This is kind of the exception right here. This is again the grizzly bear, brown bear hybrid, and they can interbreed. And actually, grizzly bears and brown bears are genetically very similar to one another and kind of considered the same species. So that one's almost, not even a good example. But all right, so how do species form? There's two main types of speciation. The process where you become a species, and the first one is called allopatric speciation. The second one is sympatric speciation. We have this nice, pretty picture here on the kind of leftish side. This has to do with these Hawaiian honey creeper birds, which are a famous example of one of the types of radiation, of adaptive radiation that we see, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the first type of speciation, though, is allopatric. This is where you have a species that develops because of geographic isolation. Allo means different, so with allopatric speciation, your species are developing because they're in different locations. So when two populations of the same species get separated by an obstacle, whether it's a mountain range, a canyon, a river, ocean, all those different things, then they face different selective pressures because they have different environments. Again, this goes back to evolution and natural selection. So looking at these fish, these pork fish, the one that's in the Caribbean over here, it's much more vibrantly colored. The one that's kind of on the Pacific side, however, which is a different species, it's different color. That's because they have different environments. At one point, these different populations were able to interbreed. The Isthmus of Panama right here hadn't kind of closed up, so they could swim from the Caribbean over to the Pacific. But as plate tectonics moved things around, we closed off this little gap that was going through here, and now these fish have kind of evolved into two different species. So again, the Caribbean is pretty clear, and clear blue water actually, bright colors get kind of drowned out in that, and you end up actually being a little more invisible to predators. Whereas that's not something that's selected for on the Pacific side. So allopatric speciation is pretty much what happened in Darwin's finches as well. When we talked about the finches, all these islands have different habitats, different selective pressures. So there was some main finch that made it over from the mainland, probably in like a storm or something like that. And as it went to the different islands, the different selective pressures chose for different traits, different beak types. So each island now has its own finches. And again, that's because they're all in different locations, different foods, and those different foods selected for different traits. The other type of speciation is what we call sympatric speciation. That prefix sim means the same, so think like synonym. I know it's sim and syn, but they're the same. This is where speciation occurs while the organisms are in the same range or location. Oftentimes this is due to like sexual selection, behavioral differences, varied selective pressures across a range, genetic mutations, or something called genetic drift. So let's take a look at a couple of these. Mutations are one of the ways that you get sympatric speciation. So oftentimes this is what happens in like plants. Plant DNA oftentimes has like a double set of DNA, and that means that if you've got a double set, you can't interbreed with the population that has a single set. So these things can often, self-pollinate and breed with other individuals that have double DNA, but they can't breed with the original population. So, you look at these yellow flowers at the top compared to the ones that are at the bottom. The pink ones, kind of the same thing. So this is examples of different wheats that have, different sets of chromosomes. And again, those mutations prevent you from breeding with, individuals who have different sets of DNA that you don't have. Other things that can lead to sympatric speciation are behavioral differences. So the apple maggot flies, they originally laid their eggs on these little things called hawthorns. But when humans started introducing apples, which are in the same family, I believe, some of the apple maggot flies laid their eggs on apples instead of these hawthorn berries. And because they laid their eggs on, the apples, they only interact with other ones that lay their eggs on apples. And so this interacting only with the ones that you're seeing, that led to, two species. One species lays theirs on the hawthorn still, and one lays it on the apples. So again, they're in the same place really, but they just have slightly different behaviors, and that's led to differences in no more interbreeding between the two groups. Another one is with these fish in Lake Victoria, which is in Africa. These fish were only introduced into the lake about 100 years ago, I think, for sport fishing and things like that. But their ancestors, they exploited different food groups. You have two types of cichlids here, this one which has the thin lips and this one which has the thick lips. But they fed at different areas within the lake, and the different feeding behaviors led to different forms, and they don't interbreed because even though they're in the same place, some of them, I believe, like feed at the top and some of them feed at the bottom of the lake. And since they're not, interacting with one another because of their feeding habits, they are spreading into two different species. So, all right, sexual selection is another one. Because organisms go through sexual selection and they choose mates based on, different characteristics, this can sometimes lead to two separate species. So these are different examples of boobies. Like this is the blue-footed booby, and I believe this is maybe the brown-footed booby and the red-footed booby. Males and females in these birds choose each other to mate, and their preferences can drive speciation. These ones obviously have deviated mainly because of the colors. So this species, for whatever reason, the females preferred blue, and these preferred kind of a yellowy brown, and these ones preferred red feet. Sometimes when you have, the sexual selection going, in two different directions for so long, it can actually lead to incompatible body parts. This actually happens with, I think, dragonflies. They have kind of gone through sexual selection so much that some of the males don't have the right reproductive organs to reproduce with females of the other species. And again, that goes just with sexual selection. So varied pressures across a range can also lead to different species. You have all these gulls that live in the same kind of area, but gulls that live in warmer climates might have larger wings, while the cold ones have smaller wings because that gives off less body heat. And those changes can add up over time. So even though they started out in the same species, they just have a really wide range. The variations across that range can lead to different species. Actually, going back to this is what happens with different salamanders too. Salamanders might live all along a mountain, but the top of the mountain doesn't have the same kind of environmental pressures as the bottom of the mountain or kind of halfway up the mountain. So genetic drift is another thing that can lead to speciation. If you have a change in a population just due to a random sample of that group becoming more numerous, then you can lead to just a different species. So the spirit bear, which lives in the northwest United States and Canada, is a population of brown bears that just has a random number of blonde bears. This is an area that has a high concentration of those. The mutation for that is just in all brown bear populations, but it's just a higher concentration there just randomly. So that's because the ones that moved to that area first, there was just a higher percentage of blonde bears that went there. And so they may eventually become a new species. They're still interbreeding with the other brown bears. So it's not a new species technically. It's just kind of like a subset group or whatever you want to call it. A breed, if you wanted to say it, thinking like dogs and stuff. So There are a couple of different patterns, though, of speciation that we're going to talk about. The first of which is punctuated equilibrium. This is where changes don't occur for a long time and then they occur pretty rapidly. So this leads to fast speciation, and the old species can change into a new one. We're not always sure why this happens. It has to do with some kind of, environmental change. But if you look here in the fossil record for these different rocks, this fossil, same, and then all of a sudden it switches really fast to being different, and it stays the same for a long time. When you look at, one of the other types of speciation patterns is called gradualism. And this is where you accumulate small changes that lead to a new species over time. So you look at this butterfly, it has two little offspring and they're slightly different, and over time you accumulate these tiny little changes from one to the next. It's difficult to tell with this when a new species begins and an old one ends, and this is probably the most common type of speciation. The last type of speciation that we're going to talk about is something called adaptive radiation, and this is where changes in the environment lead one species to change rapidly into several species. Different individuals will exploit different resources or niches in the environment, and Darwin's finches are the classic example, but we also looked at those honey creepers from Hawaii earlier. Some founding species gets to the island, and there's a variety of environments, and those variety of environments lead to just a variety of traits being selected for just based on which environment you're at. So, looking at Darwin's finches, there was an ancestor. It colonized one of the islands, and then as it goes to the different islands, there's all sorts of varieties of environmental pressures, and so therefore you get all sorts of varieties just from one individual species. Other ones you look at, again, Hawaiian honey creepers here. They have some founder species, but they have led to all this variety because there's a variety of different niches within Hawaii. All of these fish, I believe, are cichlids. They're all, from one individual species. These ones up in the upper right are sticklebacks, and same thing. One individual species got into that environment, and the variety of selected pressures led to a variety of new species. So with all this, the big takeaways you want to know are: it's difficult to determine what a species is. It's mostly, does it interbreed with other members of its own population, or if they can interbreed, it's usually not a species. There's two types of speciation: allopatric, which happens in different places, so geographic separation, and then sympatric, and that happens due to differences in genetics through mutation, differences in behavior, difference in sexual selection patterns, all that kind of stuff. And then lastly, we had the three types of speciation patterns that we saw. We saw punctuated equilibrium, which happens, nothing happens for a while and then there's a quick change. We had gradualism, which is an accumulation of tiny little changes over time that leads to big change. And then this last one, adaptive radiation, which is where you have one species leading to the formation of many different species in an area. And we saw this happening mainly on islands and isolated locations that have lots of varieties of habitats. So, as you look at different species, take a look at what do you think is the environmental pressures that led to them, forming those new species over time, and what types of patterns of speciation do you feel like you're seeing. So